Let me ask you something. What if everything you believed to be true about the world, everything you were taught, everything you were willing to die for, was a complete and total lie? This is the incredible story of German prisoners of war who, in 1943, were put on a train and sent on a journey across America. A journey that didn't just break their morale, it completely demolished their entire worldview and forced them to face a reality that would change them and their country forever. So let's start with this quote, because it's so revealing. The man who wrote this, Uno Fitzia Burkhardt, he was a soldier in Rommel's elite Africa Corps, and he's scribbling this down in secret. Now, what could possibly be so unbelievable that he thought it had to be a trick? It was the lights, just electric lights. As his train rolled through small Texas towns in the middle of the night, he saw farmhouse after farmhouse, shop after shop, every single street corner just blazing with electricity. Now you gotta remember, in wartime Germany, a strict blackout had plunged the entire nation into darkness for years. But here, in a country he'd been told was collapsing, light was just everywhere, casual, abundant. He wasn't seeing a weapon of war. He was seeing a weapon of reality. And that reality was about to shatter everything he knew. You see, to really grasp the level of shock these men were experiencing, we have to understand the world they came from. Nazi propaganda had painted a very, very specific picture of America. It was a decadent, weak, and racially divided nation that was teetering on the absolute brink of collapse. They were taught that American workers were lazy, that its factories were a joke, and that its military was pathetic. This was the lens they saw the world through, a lens that was about to be shattered into a million pieces. And that psychological dismantling, it began the second they surrendered in North Africa. For these elite soldiers, defeat was one thing, but what happened next was just alien. The American army processed hundreds of thousands of prisoners, not with brutality, but with this quiet, overwhelming competence that was honestly better than anything the German Wehrmacht could pull off. They were photographed, given medical exams, and had their Geneva Convention rights explained to them in fluent German. The very first cracks in their ideology weren't caused by force, but by a level of organization that was just baffling. This right here, from the Diary of a German Captain, this just perfectly captures how surreal the whole thing was for them. Okay, so think about it. German soldiers were transported in boxcars, the kind designed for 40 men or 8 horses. These guys expected that, or probably worse. Instead, they're led onto Pullman passenger coaches with cushioned seats and actual dining cars. And the detail that just breaks your brain? An American sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working perfectly. Can you even imagine? This wasn't just transportation. It was a display of casual luxury so profound it had to feel like some kind of calculated psychological mind game. And before they even stepped foot on American soil, they were already being fed better than they had in months, maybe even years. One soldier wrote that the standard American military rations they were given, we're talking fresh white bread, real coffee, meat twice a day, were better than what German generals were eating back on the front lines. At first they thought, okay, this is a trick. It's temporary propaganda. They just couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that this level of abundance was normal, the baseline for an American soldier, and now for them as prisoners. And it just keeps building. The very ships that carried them across the Atlantic were floating monuments to this impossible reality. They were called Liberty ships, these mass-produced cargo vessels. And get this, during the war, American shipyards built 2,710 of them. At their peak, they were launching 3 of these massive ships a day, every 8 hours. These prisoners were literally crossing the ocean on a giant piece of evidence that Germany's entire industrial strategy was completely and utterly doomed. So the journey to America was a shock. But the journey through America? That's when their minds were truly broken. From the windows of their comfy train cars, they became unwilling spectators to the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. It was a 3-day, non-stop, rolling lecture in American power, and there was absolutely no way to look away. And this is where the scale just becomes mind-boggling. Let's talk synthetic rubber. Germany had invented the process. They were proud of their chemical industry. In its best year, the entire Third Reich produced 120,000 tons. Okay, so as the prisoners' train passed a single industrial park in Kentucky, they saw a facility that had sprung up from empty fields in just 18 months. That one complex produced 800,000 tons a year. It's a number so huge it's almost meaningless, but it represented a river of rubber that was going to fuel the Allied war machine and just crush their regime. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just some farm boy being impressed by a big factory. This quote is from an expert. Oberleutnant Hoffmann was a chemist from IG Farben, the very heart of the German industrial machine. He didn't just see big buildings.
He understood the technology inside them. He could recognize the advanced equipment from the train window, and he knew, with professional certainty, that it was light years ahead of Germany's best. For him, the war was over. Right then and there. Looking out a train window in Kentucky.
The sheer pace was just as overwhelming as the scale. Their train passed Ford's Willow Run plant, a factory so huge it was visible for miles. Imagine being a Luftwaffe pilot, pressing your face to the glass and seeing a river of bombers. A brand new B-24 Liberator, a complex, 4-engine heavy bomber, was rolling off the assembly line every 63 minutes. It's insane. At other points, they passed single steel mills that produced more steel in one day than entire German industrial centers. It was a relentless 24/7 symphony of production that made any idea of a Nazi victory a complete fantasy. So every mile of track just laid another piece of propaganda to rest. The idea that cars were a luxury for the Nazi elite. They passed factory parking lots filled with hundreds of cars owned by ordinary workers. The belief that food was scarce. They saw literal mountains of oranges being bulldozed into pits just because of minor blemishes. And maybe most powerful of all, the myth of a nation weakened by diversity. They saw women, African Americans, teenagers, all operating the complex machinery of war production around the clock. The very people their ideology called inferior were outproducing the master race at a scale that was just impossible to comprehend. Okay, so America's industrial might demolished their belief in German superiority. But another weapon, one that was maybe even more powerful, was about to be deployed. American humanity. If the factory shattered their intellectual framework, what happened next shattered their emotional and moral one. It was a weapon of kindness, and it would disarm their hatred completely. So picture this. It's Christmas Day, 1943. These men are prisoners of war. Their country is actively at war with America, killing American soldiers. In their Nazi ideology, an enemy is something to be hated, dehumanized, and crushed. They expected nothing. They certainly did not expect what happened next. And this quote from Oberleutnant Muller just gets to the absolute heart of it. In camps all across the country, local church choirs showed up and sang Christmas carols in German. Boy Scout troops delivered 500,000 packages with gifts. The prisoners ate a Christmas feast that was better than anything they'd had even in peacetime. And Muller's realization is the key. This wasn't weakness. This was the ultimate expression of power and confidence. Many prisoners were moved to tears, not by the gifts, but by the simple, unexpected act of human kindness. The cumulative effect of all this, the abundance, the efficiency, the kindness, it was so profound that American intelligence officers actually gave it a name: ideological collapse syndrome. They reported that prisoners just stopped arguing. The most fanatical Nazis grew quiet. They stopped talking about victory and started asking questions. Their entire belief system had been systematically taken apart by undeniable reality. But the story doesn't end with the collapse. That's not the amazing part. The amazing part is what came next, because the collapse of one ideology creates a vacuum, a hunger for something new. And the Americans, instead of just leaving that vacuum empty, provided the tools for these men to rebuild their own worldview, transforming them from defeated soldiers into the future architects of a democratic Germany. A secret program began what might be the most successful re-education effort in history. But here's the genius part. It wasn't forced propaganda. It was voluntary. Can you believe that? Prisoners who had been told Americans were uncultured barbarians suddenly had access to massive camp libraries and multiple competing newspapers. More than 40,000 of them willingly signed up for courses on democracy and economics taught by professors from top American universities. They weren't being told what to think. They were being given the tools to think for themselves, many for the first time in a decade. And the long-term impact of this is just staggering. This wasn't just some classroom exercise. Look at these names. These are men who were held in American POW camps. They went back to Germany and became leaders, an ambassador, the president of the European Commission, a UN representative. They took the lessons of American productivity and democratic ideals and used them to build the new West Germany from the ashes. The German economic miracle of the 1950s was built, in part, by what these men learned in captivity. Now, if you're a numbers person, the data that backs this up is just astounding. Post-war surveys of these prisoners show that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Nearly 3/4 of them said the experience positively changed their entire worldview. And maybe the most telling number of all, by the end of the war, less than 10% still held on to strong Nazi beliefs.
That's not a military victory. That is a total conversion, achieved not with bullets, but with bread, dignity, and overwhelming truth.
And this quote, from a reunion of former POWs held in Texas back in 1985, it just sums up the entire journey perfectly. Herman Gutz stood up and said this to an audience of his former captors and his fellow prisoners. It perfectly captures the transformation. They came here to fight a country they thought was weak, and in defeat, they discovered its true strength. So this whole story, it forces us to ask a really fundamental question. In the end, what is a nation's greatest weapon? Is it its power to destroy? Its army, its bombs? Or is it its capacity to create, its ability to produce so much and to be so secure in its own values that it can treat a defeated enemy with a humanity that actually transforms them into a friend? Their incredible journey suggests that America's greatest weapon was never the atom bomb, but the simple, overwhelming evidence of a free society's power to build. So I'll leave you with that. What do you think is a nation's greatest weapon?